The great civilization of ancient Egypt, with its dramatic spectacle and mystery, has always fascinated me. I've been travelling the country to explore some of the intriguing stories that have emerged from this historic land. In this programme, my journey takes me the length of the country to find out what brought this remarkable civilization to an abrupt and tragic end. For me, the most striking thing about the ancient Egyptian civilization is that it lasted so long. Astonishingly, for over 3,000 years, it had a powerful grip on the imagination of all who lived here. The culture of Egypt flourished for longer than any other in history, a testament to how compelling their beliefs and traditions were. But finally, something happened that would utterly destroy the entire magnificent civilization. In this isolated place, there's something very poignant that bears witness to the extraordinary tale of the end of Egypt. It's the last trace of this great civilization in its death throes. This temple contains a very revealing and, for me, very moving detail and inscription. This is the last hieroglyphic inscription made in ancient Egypt. Our ability to read such inscriptions was lost for nearly 2,000 years. After the priests left this temple, the entire culture, language and traditions of ancient Egypt died. Everything that we now think of as distinctly Egyptian came to an end. The art and religion would never be practiced again. There would be no more pyramids, temples, mummies, or hieroglyphs. The entire buildings before the brutal end came. Incredibly, Egypt's ancient traditions would survive the first two onslaughts almost intact. But the third, the last, would finally bring it down. The story begins here in the north of Egypt on the Mediterranean coast, where the first of these three onslaughts began in the 4th century BC. It came from the Greeks, one of the few civilizations with a culture powerful enough to rival that of ancient Egypt. Egypt had been ruled by foreign dynasties in the past. For example, the Mediterranean coast of Egypt laid out a great city, the city named after himself, Alexandria. And that young man was, of course, Alexander the Great, one of the greatest conquerors the world has ever seen. It was these persuasive new ideas that would challenge the age-old beliefs of the Egyptian people. After Alexander, a Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies, ruled Egypt for 300 years. They continued to bring in the latest ideas from around the Greek Empire, and so here, in Alexandria, they built the world's intellectual heart. And the old library contained around 700,000 scrolls. These scrolls, of course, encapsulated all the learning of the ancient world, and this place is where the great minds of the ancient world met. And so they filled the library with the works of the famous Greek philosophers and scientists. Aristotle, Plato, Sophocles, and Pythagoras lined the shelves. One might think that some of these new ideas would have tempted the Egyptians to abandon their old beliefs, but they didn't. The Egyptians went on practicing their ancient religion just as they had for thousands of years. Instead, the Greek rulers themselves began to be seduced by the mystery and magic of ancient Egypt. After repeated earthquakes, the Greek part of Alexandria now lies submerged in the bay. and tantalizing evidence of just how thoroughly the Greeks adopted the Egyptian way of life. The fascinating thing about these statues is that they show Greek rulers, Ptolemies. Here, a queen, and over there, a king. No one's quite sure which king and queen these show, but they probably date from around 200 BC. But the striking thing, of course, is that these Greeks are shown in the guise of traditional Egyptian rulers. Here, a pharaoh, and there, well, a queen, or indeed a goddess, Hathor, Isis. In their headdresses, in their pose, their hair, even in the style of their clothes, these Greeks are presenting themselves even after Greek ideas, language and beliefs came flooding in. The culture of ancient Egypt withstood it all and continued to thrive. This is how the last Greek Ptolemy rulers chose to portray themselves. They had become the archetypal Egyptians. This is the great Queen Cleopatra. Despite her Greek blood, she is perhaps the best symbol of the survival and victory of the Egyptian way of life. She wore the robes of the Egyptian goddess Isis. But in 30 BC, in one of the great romantic stories of all time, Cleopatra killed herself after the death of her lover, Mark Antony. Famously, she took a snake, an asp, and held it to old gods of Egypt, and she lived and lives for eternity. It's clear from the story of Cleopatra that the age-old Egyptian beliefs were not destroyed by the invasion of Greek ideas. In fact, Egypt's ancient art and religion survived virtually intact and continue to dominate the lives of the people of this land. But how would it survive the next cultural invasion from a civilization bent on world domination? The Romans. When the Roman army marched into Egypt in 30 BC, they were determined to make this great land a mere province of the Roman Empire. And they stamped their powerful presence on Egypt, not through the introduction of new ideas, as the Greeks had done, but by bleeding the country dry. Council chamber. Here, the Roman elite of the land have gathered to decide how this great province, this colony, would have been governed. And the thing on the top of their agenda most of the time, I should imagine, would be how to exploit the vast resources, the vast natural wealth of Egypt. Rome depended on these riches to sustain its extensive territories, and Egypt became the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. A third of the amount of grain needed to feed the population of Rome came from Egypt. And it wasn't just grain. Other things are brought from Egypt: money, taxes. The people here are taxed ruthlessly. And the minerals, also gold from the south, and granite from Aswan was used to make Rome a beautiful city. With the country's wealth siphoned off to Rome, the great Egyptian temples were neglected, and the priests, once so revered, began to lose their power. And yet, in spite of all they were forced to endure from the Romans, the Egyptian people still clung fiercely to their ancient customs and beliefs. And what's more, even the Roman oppressors themselves became seduced by the traditions of this ancient land. Beneath the foundations of Alexandria is a labyrinth of catacombs where the Roman dead were once buried. Here, you can see how the Roman settlers, just like the Greeks before them, embraced ancient Egyptian customs and adopted the Egyptian gods. These Romans even mummified their dead an Egyptian tradition never practiced in any other part of the Roman Empire. So for the second time, the invasion of a mighty rival culture failed to destroy the long-held beliefs at the heart of the Egyptian way of life. But then came the third and final assault on the Egyptian civilization. It was a threat unlike any that had come before, and it would prove too powerful to resist. Around 4 BC, in a small town in the Roman province of Judea, a child was born, a child that we now know as Jesus, and his followers were to destroy the culture of the pharaohs forever. From its humble beginnings, Christianity grew so powerful that 300 years after the birth of Christ, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. As Egypt was a province of Rome, Christianity would now be imposed on the Egyptian people. This cathedral, in the heart of Alexandria, is built on the site of the very first church in Africa. And it was from here that Christianity began its relentless march through Egypt. And in the barren desert plains between Alexandria and Cairo, there's a place where we can see how Christianity began to win the battle for the very soul of the Egyptian people. Born out of the remote solitude of the Egyptian deserts were the world's first monastic communities. Of monasticism, simplicity, frugality, solitude, prayer, a very, very powerful place indeed. Beautiful, in fact. This place also offers... But Christianity could not tolerate other beliefs. Old gods were regarded as non-existent or perceived as devils. But surprisingly, in spite of their hostility to the old Egyptian pagan gods, Christians actually borrowed some of the ancient Egyptian religious practices. Some of the rituals of the old religion were appropriated and transformed by Christianity, even the idea. In fact, by the middle of the 4th century AD, half the Egyptian population had abandoned the old gods and converted to Christianity. 500 miles further south, there's an ancient Egyptian temple where we can see exactly what happened to the old sacred sites as the Christians grew in power and influence. As this new religion swept through the country, the temples built to worship the pagan gods were attacked and destroyed. The walls in this temple at Dendera, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, bear witness to this violent history. The columned hall is in a wonderful state of preservation. The only serious damage was done to it in the 4th or 5th century AD by the Christian Copts who attacked it in a sort of frenzied manner. The heads of the goddess Hathor up there. Bodies have gone. Clearly the Christians perceive these as incarnations of the devil, as sort of pagan idols to be eradicated. The result now is devastating, really. Beauty, history, destroyed in a frenzied fundamentalist. This basilica was built in the 5th century by Christians using stone robbed from the surrounding temples. That's very clear if you look down here. Here are carved stones with hieroglyphs, clearly not in the position they're meant to be. And here, even top of a column, all clearly taken from the temples each side of me. And I guess all these stones are too, but turned around so the carvings are not shown. All of this, of course, is a direct attack on the old temples, on the old gods, to kill them, to destroy their images. And here we see the cross, the abstract sign, really.
and in here, the dove of peace. Well, peace, yes, not much peace or tolerance towards the old gods of Egypt. And now through here, into the church proper, into the nave, really, the hall. And extraordinary, this big church. Christians not really prepared to tolerate the old gods. They can't do that. Only one God, Christian God. Other gods must be destroyed. And this church built here in the middle of this temple complex to appropriate this ancient sacred land, the sacred ground. The irony, of course, is that while the church is now a ruin, the old temples of the old gods survive, more or less intact.
The very stones of monuments like these tell the dramatic story of how Christianity conquered Egypt, stealing from the sacred temples to build their own churches and vandalizing the images of the ancient gods. But what about the people who are still worshipping in these temples? Those who clung to the customs further and further south until there was only one place left for them. And that's where the story ends.
I'm going to a place that's beautiful and once most sacred to the old gods of this land, and which played an important, indeed poignant role in the history of Egypt.
Far in the south of Egypt, on the remote island of Philae in the Nile, you can see the last moments of the civilization of the pharaohs.
Here, on this temple behind me, on this small island in the Nile, became the last bastion of those faithful to the great ancient deities. This island was dedicated to Isis. She was meant to protect this land, but eventually even this bastion succumbed to the march of Christianity.
Those who still continued to worship the ancient Egyptian gods were part of this beautiful, isolated temple that we can find that last hieroglyph. For me, it's one of the most moving things I've seen in the whole of Egypt. Tucked away in a corner of the temple, this tiny detail is almost impossible to find, unless you know where to look.
And that detail is this inscription, part here and part over here. What this says is that I am Nesmet, scribe in the house of the books of Isis. So he's in the library, a librarian, and he's making a plea here to the god Mandalus, the son of Horus, to be benevolent to him, Nesbet, for eternity. And this inscription is made on the 24th of August, which is the birthday of Osiris. And we know, in fact, that was carved in the year 394 AD. And so, as far as anyone can tell, these are the last hieroglyphic inscriptions made in Egypt in historic times. When we look at these, we are, in effect, looking at the last moment, the death of Egyptian culture and civilization.
Priests were the only ones who could understand this archaic language. When they were forced out of this temple, their knowledge was lost and forgotten. The pattern of Christian destruction continued here, as it had in the other temples.
Up here is Hathor Isis, but she's been literally sort of scratched to death, gouged out, removed from the surface of the building. Quite terrifying, the violence of this sort of clawing action. And up here, there's an inscription that reveals more about all this. It's written in Greek, put up here by the Coptic Christians. It congratulates those people that committed this vandalism on the building, saying this great structure has been well cleansed of the images of the pagan gods. This portion of the Temple of Isis was converted into a Christian church. The images of the old gods on the walls were plastered over, obscured, and crosses cut into the walls. I see one over there.
This culture and tradition had flourished and evolved from the banks of the Nile for over 3,000 years. Yet it took only hundreds of years for Christianity to finally destroy it.
Of course, Egypt had lost political independence in the past, but its culture had always survived. But now, thousands of years of cultural continuity staggered to an end. It's absolutely tragic, really. The destruction was awful. The destruction of a way of life, a culture, a civilization, a religion. But strangely, coming to Egypt, one's aware that all is not dead. These temples, these mansions of the millions of years, attract people in their thousands still. One feels, in a way, that the old gods are still alive.
Tomorrow night at 8 on BBC Two, Dubai Dreams looks at the workers in the country that has no unions, no minimum wage and few workers' rights. Next tonight, Adrian Chiles rounds up the weekend's Premiership action in Match of the Day 2.